So let's talk about DOGE very briefly, right? One of the arguments that's been leveled against DOGE, there's a lot of, I've heard a lot of positive arguments, certainly, but one of the arguments that's been leveled against DOGE is that it seems too arbitrary, right? There's too much being taken out. It's unclear. I'm thinking about these regulations, right? If you're saying there's 5% that are doing something, 95 that aren't, if you get rid of the wrong 5, you could create a mess for exactly the reasons you just described. Is it possible this is the situation with DOGE?
Yeah, it's always tricky if you're reforming a large organization. So the U.S. government employs about 2.4 million civilian workers. They have budgets, of course, about $6 trillion that they spend. It is by far the largest organization on Earth. Well, outside of China anyway. It's a very, very large organization. It is dysfunctional, I think, by all accounts. No matter which side of the political aisle you're on, people recognize that the federal government is dysfunctional. It's also protected by a lot of basically crony rules that have been inserted in there by government unions, by organizations of government workers. Government workers, ever since sort of the inception of the bureaucratic state, they've always voted left. They've sent their political donations to the left. They've aided the left, which is quite natural, right? The people who work for the government, of course, want a larger government. And so that means that they've had the ability, whenever the Democrats are in power, they've had the ability to insert these sort of barriers. And so if you're trying to shrink it, if you're talking about a private company, you can just go in there and look through what's efficient, what's inefficient, and then cut the fat. With the federal government, it's very, very tricky because they've inserted sort of all of these tripwires and traps and fake doors. And so they have to go after what they're able to go after initially. So to give an example, when you join the federal government, the first year you are a probationary worker. It's much easier to fire you. You don't yet have all of those government union rules. Now, what they're currently doing is targeting those probationary workers because they're the low-hanging fruit. In a perfect world, they would not do that, right? Instead, they would, look at all of the employees and they would say, I don't care how long you've been here. Are you good at your job or are you not? And of course, they know that. This is what Trump does in his organizations. This is what Elon specifically did with Twitter. He did not fire everybody who was there 1 year. Rather, he looked at everybody and saw if they were good workers or not. But because of all of those trap doors and tripwires inserted into sort of the federal, to protect the federal bureaucracy, they have to do it that way. Now, they've made a couple of mistakes. I think they laid off, there were some nuclear inspectors or something where they rehired them within like 12 hours. Elon has said that that's going to happen. When you throw in the postal workers and the military, you're talking close to 5 million people. If you're trying to trim a 5 million person, completely dysfunctional organization, yes, you're going to make mistakes in both directions.
Is it as simple as saying, remove those regulators and you've created this many jobs?
So you sort of start the game with a certain number of regulations, and then you hire regulators, and the regulators create new regulations, right? And so at this stage of the game, ideally, you would get rid of the regulators so they stop creating new ones, but you would also get rid of the unnecessary regulations themselves. And both Elon and Vivek had talked about that since the beginning of DOGE, that one of the goals is going to be to go through and identify which regulations, not just useless, but which ones are unauthorized, which ones lack congressional authority. Get rid of those, and at that point, you should get rid of the regulator because they're not doing anything. They're not enforcing anything. And so that really follows from a very important Supreme Court decision last year called Loper Bright v. Raimondo. And that was a case that asked whether executive rules have the same weight as Congress. So the way that our constitutional system works is that Congress is supposed to come up with laws. But in fact, well over 90% of the effective laws that we have to follow are actually rules that were written by the executive branch. They have no congressional authority. And so the case was over whether the executive has the right to effectively write laws, to just make up laws that don't have congressional authority. And the Supreme Court said no. And so in a perfect world, what would have happened at that point is that Joe Biden's administration would have sat back and said, okay, this is very important because it means that the vast majority of what we're doing is unconstitutional. And so we have to go back and review all of these rules and see which one the Supreme Court just said are unconstitutional. So effectively what Trump is doing is enforcing the will of the Supreme Court, which the rogue Biden administration had been ignoring. What it means for us on the ground is you could slash back of the envelope 95% of regulations because they don't have congressional authority. So there are thousands and thousands of regulations that are put out every year. It'll make you sick if you go and look at the list just month after month, while Congress passes very, very few of those. And so the idea would be go back to the few rules that Congress does pass. If Congress is unable to pass a rule, to regulate how big the trout you can catch is or something like that, then that means that, the federal government is therefore silent on it. And so the people have the right to do that. So it expands the scope for liberty, but it also, of course, creates a lot of business opportunities where small businesses especially can enter a space, entrepreneurs can come in, create new businesses, and then eventually expand them.
So, I mean, absolutely fascinating. First of all, how you're kind of framing all this for me. What do you think of how DOGE has been conducted thus far?
I think it's been incredible. It's something that both parties have been trying for decades. This is not a Republican issue. Both Bill Clinton, even Obama, they tried to rationalize government to make it more efficient.
We know big government does not have all the answers. We know there's not a program for every problem. We know, and we have worked to give the American people a smaller, less bureaucratic government in Washington. And we have to give the American people one that lives within its means. The era of big government is over.
Al Gore famously, he was going to make the government more efficient. He was carrying around an ashtray. It was like an $800 ashtray from the Pentagon or something. This has been a long-standing issue that has been recognized by both parties. And it's actually interesting. DOGE itself was created by Barack Obama. It was called the U.S. Digital Service, USDS. And he created that in the aftermath of the Obamacare website fiasco. So that was very embarrassing. And they said, okay, the federal government is dysfunctional. We're going to create this agency whose job is to go through and find efficiencies over, or above all, technical efficiencies. So they gave them a huge amount of power to go into each agency and look at how they're doing things and then make it better. And so I don't know whose idea it was, but what Trump and Elon did was they simply took that. Instead of U.S. Digital Service, now it's the U.S. DOGE Service. He simply renamed the organization, which Obama had created and had given all that authority. He renamed it. It already had authority. It already had, budget for staff. And so that is DOGE. So this notion that DOGE is some outside creation, no, it was created by Obama. And it was created because there's a longstanding need recognized by all parties to rationalize the federal government to make it more efficient. It's just that when it's Trump doing it, the Democrats go nuts. When it was Clinton doing it, Clinton laid off several 100,000 federal workers. Not a peep. That was all about efficiency. It made a lot of sense, is what New York Times tells us. When Trump does it, it's literally destroying democracy.
And what about this idea, Trump kind of upped his game in terms of, for every new regulation or rule created, you have to cut some number. Now it's up to 10 from what I understand.
It's great. It's rookie numbers. I'm going to get that to 50, but yeah, no, it's fantastic. And his first term, I think he had said, I think it was 3 for 1 or 2 for 1. And that ended up being 7. And so like any manager, now he's going for a stretch goal here. So he's going for 10 for 1. The question is also, how much does the regulation cost, right? So if you put in one big regulation, you take out 10 tiny ones, which is traditionally, that's what the federal government tries to do, because every agency is trying to keep power. wants to keep power because power is budget. Budget is how you get ahead in Washington. Apparently, it's how you get a golden parachute when you're done with the whole gig. So, you have to kind of prevent them from gaming that. Now, that takes us back to DOGE. That's a big reason why you want to lay off so many people, is you want to make sure that they're not gaming it. They're not trying to follow the letter of the law while violating the spirit, which is, of course, something that we've seen an awful lot of these past 4 years, certainly, but arguably really this past 100 years.
Do you think that DOGE will be able to cut $2 trillion, as Elon Musk has identified as the number?
The trick is Congress. Elon wants to. I think Trump wants to. Congress is the problem. Congress is a drunk 16-year-old with a credit card. They always have been. They will grab a hold of every dollar and they'll find another way to spend it. So, for example, Trump is trying to wind down the Ukraine war. He's trying to resolve the Middle East conflict. And yet Republicans in Congress are trying to increase the military budget, which is already obscenely high. I think they need to be kept on a very short leash. The question there is, Republican voters are 90 or 95% with Trump. I know whenever I talk about Republicans in Congress, there is a lot of frustration with them. But I think that traditionally, the dynamics in Congress, the way they've worked is that the mainstream media, the left-wing legacy media, was able to be the filter, right? They could whisper into ears, they could manipulate reality, they could gaslight voters. And so Republicans in Congress they sort of have an institutional culture where they lean left, because if they go to the right, if they actually try to cut government, say, media will come after them. Whereas if they go left, media will cover for them with voters. And I think one of the biggest lessons of the 2024 election was that those days are gone, right? They rolled out the H word every single day, the Austrian corporal. They rolled that out every single day in the last week. That had been very taboo in the old days. They went for broke and it didn't work. And so I think that Republicans in Congress they're behind the curve. They don't understand that those old days of left-wing media covering for left-wing policy, those are gone. Now the media, whether it's Epoch, whether it's people like me, we are the people who are talking with Republican voters. I think what is likely to happen in 2026 is that there's going to be a lot of primaries where a lot of rhinos, a lot of left-wing Republicans are going to get knocked out. That is then going to serve as a warning to the rest of them, and they'll straighten up. But for the moment, I think there's still a lot of Republicans in Congress who would rather take all the DOGE savings and just find something else to spend it on. It could be farm subsidies. It could be more military. And Democrats, of course, always want to spend more money. That's the whole point. So I'm less optimistic than I was in the beginning, simply because Congress doesn't seem to be appropriately afraid of the voters yet.